Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the Professional Development Series. We are in for a treat as we close out on this evening with Principal Kafele, as he brings us a title called Today's Lesson, The Power in Us. This engaging, informative, and courageous conversation focuses on the collective power that educators have to shape district and building culture, which directly impacts what happens in the classroom and the educational arena. Drilling down on advocacy, civic engagement, and leadership, Principal Kafele will remind us that our vote is our power. So without further ado, I introduce to some and reintroduce to others the incomparable Principal Kafele to bring us something to resonate in our soul. Welcome, Principal Kafele.
Thank you. Thank you. Much appreciated. Much respect. Great to be here today and so much to talk about. And let's just jump into that title, The Power in Us. You know, when I think about that title, because it's actually a title that I use, or a phrase that I use pretty regularly. The power is in us. But when I think about the power being in us, I often think about the power in the individual, because how can there be this collective power if there are individuals that do not feel that same sense of power? Of course, I understand synergy. 1 + 1 = 3. In fact, I often say 1 + 1 = 100. But as an individual, as the individuals who are a part of that collective, we've got to feel like we've got something. So I want to look at that. I want to look at the individual, but I also want to look at the collective in terms of the power within all of us. So let's take a look at it. You know, I want to start off talking about culturally relevant pedagogy. And it's interesting if I could share a little bit about my background, my foray into education, if you will. Here I was, I graduated from undergrad school in 1986. And I had an epiphany and then a metamorphosis. And I delved deeply into African-American history. I didn't go to school having even a scintilla of knowledge of what African-American history was, African Caribbean history, African European history, African continental history. I didn't have that understanding. I went into school as an empty vessel. But I stumbled on African-American history when I got there. Literally the first day I stumbled on a book that was entitled To Kill a Black Man by Lewis Lomax, a book that paralleled the lives of Dr. King and Malcolm X. And from reading that book, I wanted to know everything that I could learn about Malcolm, and I wanted to know everything I could learn about Dr. King. But as I accumulated books after books after books on these men's lives, on the two of their lives, now I wanted to know what they knew, particularly as it related to history. And that's what took me into this obsession with studying history. But by the same token, I'm a student. And I elevated from a very low performing high school student to graduating summa cum laude at Kane University here in Jersey. And a lot of people ask me, well, how'd you do that? How'd you make that possible? How'd you make that happen? Because we remember you from all those previous years. And I said, very simple. My attitude shifted as a result of what I immersed myself into relative to this history. And I felt at that time I was like a walking encyclopedia. There was very little you could ask me that I couldn't answer very intelligently, if not intellectually, about African-American history. So now 2 years later, I become an elementary school teacher. I didn't go to school to become a teacher. I went to school to become a businessman. I studied marketing. But by the time I finished that program, I knew what I wanted to do, but I was already so deeply immersed into the major, I didn't want to start over. So I went on and graduated with a marketing degree and then studied education soon after graduating from undergraduate school. So here's the thing as it relates to the topic I have on the screen, culturally relevant pedagogy. When I walked into that classroom in Brooklyn, New York City, 1988, I didn't know too much. All I knew in terms of my life's accumulated knowledge was African-American history. That's all I knew. I didn't have anything else because I was that horrible of a student. So this transformation that occurred was quick, it was sudden, it was drastic. And now my knowledge base was rooted in what I read in these books that are all over this house now. So therefore, hear me well. When I walk into a classroom on day one, I don't know what the average teacher knows, which put me at an advantage as it related to the students that I was soon to teach. I'm in Brooklyn. I'm in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn, New York City. 100% of those young people are Black. They're African American, they're African Caribbean, they're Black. So here I am, I'm walking into this classroom as a Black male teacher, the only one in the building, and one of the only ones within the vicinity. And all I know is their history. So what am I going to do? It was natural for me to take African American history and infuse it into the math lessons that I taught, the science lessons that I taught, the language arts lessons that I taught, and naturally the social studies / history lessons that I taught. It was only natural because I didn't know better. If I was politically incorrect, which I discovered that I was quickly, I didn't know better because it was all I knew. So I was just infusing that which I knew. But here's the translation. The students were achieving. They were achieving at high levels because they were seeing themselves on the pages. They were seeing themselves in the lesson. So I learned later that what I was doing was very unorthodox. But as you look at how the world has evolved, and particularly the United States, what I was doing instinctively is now what everybody is craving. So it's funny how it just kind of came full circle. I tell people all the time, my audiences every day, that back in those days, it's like I had to peep out the door, the classroom door, to make sure the coast was clear. The principal's not around, the assistant principal's not around. Okay, they're not around. Let me close the door, and now let me get into this consciousness raising education, right? But now everybody's called Principal Kafele. We need to understand that because our Black children are not achieving at the levels that we believe that they can. Yeah, because there was some missing information. There was some missing ingredients all these years, all these generations, and now you figured that out. So let's look at this. Let's go further with it. I'm calling this segment the Ashland Elementary School story, and this was the first school I taught at in New Jersey, because I started in New York, but I'm not a New Yorker. I went to New York because it was easy to get certification, to be quite frank. And once I realized that I loved it, I said, now I'm going to do it the proper way and get certified correctly. And I'll do it in my home state in New Jersey, but not just my home state, but in the city that produced me. Let me go back home to the school system that produced me, and I want to teach there. So that was East Orange, New Jersey. So now I'm in East Orange at this school, and everything I said about New York in terms of being culturally relevant with my pedagogy, I intensified it when I got there. So I'm looking at the curriculum materials that I have, and I said, I got to get more. I've got to invest hundreds of dollars that I didn't have, but we came up with it in terms of bringing the resources and the materials that the students needed in order to take them to another level. So right now we're talking about the power in me. We're going to get to us, but the power in me. So the power in me said, I know I'm going against the grain now, because I've heard that there's been enough in my ear to let me know that, but that's okay, because I understand what these young people need. I understand what it did for me as an individual, not realizing my own intelligence, my own brilliance, thinking that I wasn't born with that's for other people. And then coming into that understanding of the shoulders upon which I stand, which told me that I can achieve anything I conceptualize achieving. I said, that's who I've got to be as it related to these children. That's the approach that I have to bring them. I have to take those content areas, content areas that they're being exposed to, and ensure that they see themselves in the lessons. So moving on, I said there's certain material I need to bring. And I want to be very honest in this presentation regarding this screen. Those 4 books that you see there, well, the first 3, the ones in color, I literally have not seen those books since 1997. This frame was created yesterday. I haven't seen these books since 1997, my last day as a classroom teacher. So I was searching for some material for this presentation, and I stumbled on this big box with all those 6 boxes of all those resources that I brought to the school, supplementing what the school was providing, because information like this just wasn't part of the curriculum there. So, or too many places, unless you got some real progressive people there. So I said, let me take these 3 books and put them in the PowerPoint, and I use them. And I always take pictures of books with my hand in the book. That's like my signature. And I said, this book, Africa's Not a Country. That wasn't part of the curriculum, but I got students who are descendants of the African continent. Let me use that as a resource for them to understand the totality and the complexities of the continent of Africa. Then I said this book, Our Story, which was a history of African America. This book starting with 1950 on up, but then there was another companion with it, to it, that went further back. And then this workbook by Dr. Molefi Asante, and I should have said the authors' names of the previous 2, Dr. Arthur Lewin, and then Molefi Asante with the activity book for African American history, Journey to Liberation, and just so many activities there. And then one of my adult books, I kind of threw in there, Black Inventors of America, because I wanted them to understand that a lot of what they see that they may take for granted in terms of inventions were actually invented by people that look just like them. So I didn't want them to necessarily associate greatness in sports and greatness in entertainment and limit it to that. I wanted them to see the greatness in themselves relative to science and invention, technology, mathematics, architecture, and engineering, medicine, agriculture, and I can go on and on. I wanted astronomy, astrology. I wanted them to see that correlation, that relationship between who they are and those disciplines, particularly historically, but even in contemporary times. So as this unfolded, and then we're looking at the volume of students on the honor roll, just about all of them, and we're looking at the volume of students who were passing New Jersey State standardized assessments, just about all of them, and we're outperforming everybody else in the building, then the question continued to be, Kafele, what is that you're doing that your students are achieving at such high levels? And I said, it's simple. It's very simple. We're putting them on the page. So that the material I use, I'm still covering curriculum, and that's critical, because I'm part of an organization, I'm a school district, so I have to cover curriculum. But see, as I always say, let's use this sheet of paper. I'm gonna use it 2 ways. First, I'm gonna use it as curriculum. Curriculum is a lifeless document. That's all it is. It has no life. It's not alive. But it's that master teacher, if I could position myself right in the camera, it's that master teacher that does this to the curriculum. That master teacher breathes life into it. So if that master teacher has a curriculum, for example, this Eurocentric and the African presence, the African American presence, etc., is absent from that curriculum, or is distorted, or is marginalized or omitted, that master teacher said, that's all right. That's all right. I got this. Because that teacher knows more than curriculum. That teacher has mastered that content area. On top of that, teacher has mastered children. So as I always say, the sequence is I teach children first, subject area secondarily. So that teacher has mastered children, but has mastered the content. That's on the one hand. But let's look at this sheet of paper differently. Let's call this a photograph. And for the viewers that will see this recording, you're looking at it's a sheet of paper, but I'm using it as a photograph of all of you. So everybody that watches this video, you're in the photo. So if I send a text out or several text messages out with the photo, and you get your copy, and it's got a group of all the people watching in the one photo, right? Well, the first person that you're going to look for in the photo is you. You're not looking at and for other people before you look for yourself, because that's just human nature. You want to check out, how'd I look in the photo, before you look for other folks in the photo, particularly people that you may know that may be sitting near you in your vicinity. Well, here's what I came to understand. Children, when they walk in the classrooms every day, the teacher says, as they walk past them through the doorway, here you go, take your photo. So each student, good morning, take your photo. Good morning, take your photo. They call them by their name. Good morning, Jalil, take your photo. Good morning, Jamila, take your photo. Right, and it goes on, take your photo. And then they get their photo and they sit down at their desk and they take a look at the photo. And the photo doesn't look like the one I just showed you that had you in it. Their photo looks like this. And youngster says, wait a minute. The first youngster says, wait a minute, teacher, hold up. When you took the group photo yesterday, I was sitting right here. And the next youngster says, and teacher, I was sitting right here. And the next one says, and I was sitting right here. And the next one says, and teacher, I was sitting right here. And another one says, and I was sitting right here, teacher. And collectively they say, teacher, why'd you cut me out of the photo? And let me kind of get up in my camera on this one, because the teacher says, I don't know, but you're right. I cut you out of the photo, clearly. But I don't know why I did so. But it's evident that I did. Let me bring you up to speed on what just happened. Your photo is a real photo. Their photo, I'm using symbolically and figuratively. Their photo is symbolic of curriculum and instruction. And with curriculum and instruction, the youngsters notice that with the lesson, hear me somebody, that they are absent from the lesson. Where's me? Where's my representation in this lesson? What has this got to do with me when I leave here at 3 o'clock at dismissal time? What does this lesson have to do with me? What's the correlation between this lesson and my success in my life later on? I don't see it. I don't see the connection, teacher. That's what this means. There are Black children all over America entering schools, entering classrooms every day where they have been cut out of the photo. And then you and I scratch our heads. Why are Black children not achieving at the levels that we know they could? Why are Black boys not achieving at the levels that we know they could? Why are Black children underperforming in relationship to other subgroups? And so on. And I say, but it doesn't have to be. We just have to make sure that we don't cut them out of the photo. We've got to make sure when they walk into the classroom every day, they have an inherent place in the photo. So when I became this new rookie green raw elementary teacher, I just knew instinctively, because see, there was no equity conversation back then in the late 80s, early 90s. Nobody was using that word in education. They were using that word with owning a home. There was no conversation about culturally responsive and culturally relevant pedagogy. And if there was, it was in small, tight spaces. It wasn't the national conversation in the world of education, professional development. We were not talking about social justice education. And as I so frequently like to remind folks, racial justice education. Sometimes we kind of, like when we use social justice, it's the same thing when we talk about multiculturalism, right? A phrase that I struggle with, because I may not be talking about multiple cultures. I may be talking specifically about Black children. For example, I may specifically be talking about Black and brown children, Black and Latinx children, and not so much the world's cultures. But that multicultural language or jargon kind of makes things a little confusing. So when we talk about social justice education, which I'm gonna get into today, a lot of times I'm not talking necessarily social justice, which boils down to a euphemism in those cases. I'm talking racial justice. I'm talking about Black people specifically. So sometimes we got to make that distinction. So when you look at the titles of these books, for example, and consider where I was in East Orange, New Jersey, where 100% of the student body, or 99%, was African American, I'm talking race right now. I'm talking Africa is not a country. I'm talking our story as Black people, a history of African America. I'm talking African American history, a journey of liberation, and Black inventors of America. So I'm being very specific in that regard. And that always has to be pointed out, because sometimes it gets lost or it becomes a little blurred and obscure. So again, using this material allowed me to take the young people to heights that were probably previously unimagined. And everybody was curious as to what that was we were doing. So again, that's the power in the teacher to start us off, the power in me. Let's expand that now. Let's expand it. The power in us. I soon after, in 1998, I become a principal at that school. That's a recent picture that I took for a presentation. I really didn't want that police car in it, but it was parked there and I couldn't get around it. So there we are. So, but Sojourner Truth Middle School in East Orange, New Jersey. That was my first principalship. I led 4 schools over the course of 14 years. But this experience is always going to be a little bit more special for me than the other 3 schools that I led, although each of them have their own unique place in my heart. But this one has a place in my soul, because this is the one where I think I was able to prove to the world what can happen with Black children when this happens, when they're on the page, right? As opposed to this. Let me explain it to you. I become a principal. I convinced the superintendent, when he was looking to make a hire, that everything I did in the classroom as a teacher, I can replicate that as a principal. Now, I don't mean in terms of the previous slide, in terms of the cultural relevance. That wasn't part of the conversation yet. It was just, I can raise these achievement levels. I can get these students to where you want them to be. So then he hires me. So I immediately go and schedule a meeting with him. And I said, Doc, I can take these young people to a level, even though I'm green, raw, naive, haven't led a day in my life as a principal. But I said, I can take these youngsters to heights that no one even imagined they could be. I said, but I need you to allow me to do something. This school at the time, the superintendent made the district a magnet school district. It's a public school district, but he made a magnet school. So now it was schools of choice. You can choose where you want to be based on what each school was offering, right? So not charter schools or anything of that nature. Just you literally ride a bus to go to the school that addressed what your interests were. So my school, Sojourner Truth Middle School at the time, that I inherited, was known as the Sojourner Truth Middle School Institute of Science and Technology. That's what it was. So those children that had an interest in going further than what the district offered for everybody in science and technology, that was the place to be. So I get there, and I noticed that science and technology in that school that I was hearing about when I was a teacher, I said, it's really not what I thought it was. You know, I was expecting more. So it's really not what I thought it was, but so I want to enhance that. But then there's another component I want to add to it. We're getting to the us now. I said, Doc, will you allow me to make learning relevant for these learners? This is a Black district. The school is Black, but the children are not on the pages. I had the audacity to say that. The children are not on the pages. They're not in the lesson. Can I do what I did as a teacher, but now magnify that to the building level? He said, well, I'll let you do it. He said, but I'm gonna hold you accountable. And what that meant was, the translation was, I'm gonna give you 3 years, when those, because I said to him, give me 3 years when the 6th graders are 8th graders. So he said, I'm gonna give you the 3 years, because I didn't want to be held accountable for the students who were there that with such a significant or drastic change, the students who were there under the previous administration. I said, with the incoming 6th grade, when they become 8th graders, I promise you we'll be #1 in that district of middle schools. We have 4 or 5 middle schools in the district. He said, fine, I'm gonna hold you accountable for it. I got you, no problem. So now we go to work. We look at all curriculum and we say, how do we infuse in those curriculum, in each curriculum, the children that we service? How do we put them in that curriculum? That was #1. So language arts, social studies, science, language arts, that's the us now. Because now I got my team, I got my crew, and we're working in the summer. So folks coming in and rolling up their sleeves, and we're saying, how do we ensure that we're speaking to the needs of the students based on who they are? But I didn't stop there. Because we were a magnet school, Institute of Science and Technology, I go back to the superintendent now. Hey, Doc, can I add a name onto the name of the school? We're Sojourner Truth Middle School, Institute of Science and Technology. Can I add something? He said, what do you want to add? I said, I would like to call it Institute of Science, Technology, and African-Centered Studies. Can I do that, Doc? He said, I'm gonna let you do it, but I'm gonna hold you accountable. I'm good with that. So now, all literature, all promotional information, letters home, everything said Sojourner Truth Middle School, Institute of Science, Technology, and African-Centered Studies. So what did that mean? Let me show you. I want to show you a book here. I had known of this book for a long time. Matter of fact, yeah, I'll show you the actual, but I have it on the screen. I had known of this book for a long time, Journey to Liberation by Dr. Molefi Asante, the individual that created the first PhD program in African Studies on the planet at Temple University. But let me switch screens so I can show you. There's the book there. See it better that way. So I had known of this book. And I had always thought to myself, man, if I could ever make that a standard textbook, these kids are going to achieve in ways that no one has ever seen before. So I go to him and I say, Doc, I had a copy of the book. Can I create an elective where X percentage of our students are required to take this course on top of everything they're taking, not in place of? He said, okay, because you see, I'm asking him for a lot of things now. He said, okay. He said, what about curriculum? And you see the picture on the right. I said, I'm gonna write that. I'm gonna write that. I said, I wanna create a course around this book for grade 6 and grade 8. So, you know, thinking about how in a lot of schools, you'll have Algebra 1 in grade 9, and then instead of Algebra 2 in grade 10, it'll be geometry in grade 10, and then Algebra 2 in grade 11 or junior year. I said, I want to give them a taste of African-American history in grade 6, and then I want to go full scale in grade 8. But in grade 7, let me show you what I did. Grade 7, I want to take them back to the Nile Valley. Course called Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization by Dr. Anthony Browder, that book. And then I want to write a curriculum around that. So I had some other teachers who were very well versed in Nile Valley culture. And in particularly in this book, they wrote the curriculum for that, while I wrote the previous curriculum for Journey to Liberation. So now here we got all these middle school age children taking probably what could be considered a college level course. I found the teachers who were most familiar with this content, and not only were they familiar, but they were on fire about teaching it. And then all the other subject areas, we got this new theme in the school. We got this African-centered studies theme going on. So now let's look at the us, because with the us, see, we were a young staff. You know, this is going back. So we were young principal and a young staff. So we're hungry, we're fired up, we're excited, we're energized, we're enthusiastic, we're ready to get it done, and we're putting forth maximum effort. So now, with that, we got the curricular piece in place. But now, what else can we do? Well, the aesthetic of the school, we needed that to mirror what it was that we wanted to accomplish. And then the types of programming that we brought into the school, the lecturers, the speakers, the assembly speakers, all that kind of thing. We said, let's bring in the folks that are going to reinforce what it is that we're doing in the classroom. So there's this whole theme which started with the morning announcements and the recitation of the Nguzo Saba, the 7 principles of Kwanzaa, and the singing of Lift Every Voice and Sing for 180 days a year, and making sure that students understood what they were singing and what they were reciting. Let me tell you something, folks. Them 3 years went by very quickly. And when those results came back, I got a staff. It's us now. Matter of fact, I don't even want to talk about the results yet. Let me backtrack, because part of my charge today is to talk about climate and culture as well. See, when you talk about the culture, the environment that those young people were walking into every day, it wasn't what it used to be. I remembered it because I was an assistant principal in that same school. And I was with a principal that did not understand how to use me. So I was a full-time disciplinarian. And if there are any assistant principals that watch this particular presentation, if you're a full-time disciplinarian, you better join me at principalkafele.com so that we can change that, right? Because that should not be what you do. Discipline could be a fraction of what you do, but if you find that you're from 8 to 3, a disciplinarian, a lot of your behavioral issues are because of you being in that capacity. Because see, behavior is not the issue. See, behavior and discipline, that's micro. That's all that is, it's micro. And what we have to look at is the macro. Macro is now, we're talking about the building, but we're talking about the culture of the building. We're talking about the climate of the building. Not some checklist on a chart on a classroom wall that says rules and consequences. That's not what it's about. It's about what is the culture of the school that is such that it runs, it's the antithesis of behaviors which are undesirable. It runs counter to behaviors which are undesirable. So that the youngster comes into the school and recognizes instantaneously that the behavior that I thought I was going to engage in is incompatible with the norms, the values, the mores, the standards, the expectations of my school. But that's us collectively. That's us collectively relative to molding and shaping this culture into what we wanted it to ultimately become. See, so now we've got this theme throughout the building that's reflective of the students who are in the building, and the same thing can be accomplished even in a diverse setting. It's just a matter of being very intentional about knowing who's in the building and how do we structure the building in a way that it is inclusive of everybody. So now, achievement. Oh man, I was glad to walk to that superintendent and say to him, Doc, I mean, hey, I didn't have to say it to him because he gets the test scores before I do. So it was just I told you what was going to happen. Public school. I told you what we were going to do. I told you we were going to achieve. I told you we'd be #1 in the district of East Orange School District. But here's what I didn't tell him. I didn't tell him we'd be #1 in the state of New Jersey of schools of similar demographics, because I hadn't thought that broadly. My focus was on the school in my first few years of principal leadership. So I was focused on let's be #1 in the district. But once I went and studied the data of the state, I said, wow, we outperformed everybody. There's Black, brown, and poor, and that's a whole lot of districts in New Jersey. It wasn't confined to those districts either. So the question was, what did you do? I said, us, man. See, it's like, that word advocacy, right? We were advocates for these young people. We were there for these young people. We were activists for these young people, in addition to being teachers and leaders and educators for these young people. We said, we've got to bring them what they need. There haven't been many models like this in a public school setting in America, period, up to 2020, right? You don't see a lot of this. But I think that where the world is right now, I think that the world is evolving. I'm not going to be naive and say that we're going to see this wholesale change. I'm not going to say that. But I will say that there's a whole lot of folks who are open to hearing something that's very different than what they're accustomed to. I know that just on the volume of the emails that I receive every day from folks who are saying, we need to look at things differently, Principal Kafele, and we're familiar with your work, and we want to bring your work into our school so that we can have these conversations. So with that, let me go back to Nile Valley Contribution to Civilization. We said, you know, I was very adamant that I can't solely focus on African American. I want these students to know their African roots. I want them to know their West African roots, but I want them to go all the way to the East Coast of Africa. I want to take them all the way to ancient Egypt, right? I want them to learn the continent, but I want them to know, I want them to feel a connection to some of the best of times on the African continent. I want them to feel that. I want them to understand and be able to see their place along the continuum. But the beauty was, that wasn't a Kafele thing. That was just, you know, it was just me that kind of brought the idea, or had teachers there that wanted it, but didn't have the leadership that would fight for it. So now they've got this leader who's willing to fight for it, who's willing to approach the superintendent about it and the Board of Education, that we can make the changes that you want. We can achieve what it is that you would want us to achieve, but we got to do it differently. We got to do it non-traditionally. So what a beautiful thing as I reflect back on the team, right? How the culture shifted and how young people were all about themselves relative to who they are historically and culturally speaking, and just the various different accomplishments and things that we had put in place, put in motion, which would take more time than I have here to talk about, but we can do that at another time. So let me keep moving. I'm calling this the Newark Tech story, young men's empowerment. This is more the collective now. I move on from that district, and I was in that district twice. There was another district that I just didn't fit in here. And I went to Newark, and I said, you know, I'm gonna take this to another level now. So, and what I mean by that, it says on the title, Young Men's Empowerment. I said, you know, we've been focused on the whole historical cultural component, but I didn't have the kind of focus I wanted. I had a focus on male empowerment, but not to the extent that I wanted to have. So I get to this school and I say to the superintendent, there's a course that's missing here. And this is a low performing school. It's the lowest performing school in our district. I said, there's a course that's missing here. I said, we don't have the course called Manhood 101. I got a school full of boys. I mean, we got male and female, but I got my boys, and their data represents the lowest performers. I said, but here we have all these great core. This is a CTE school, vocational technical school. So in addition to the content areas, we got auto body, auto mechanics, carpentry, welding, plumbing, right? And dental assistant, nursing, computer technology, CAD lab, computer assisted drawing. I mean, we got it all. We got the best of W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington in the same space. And that's how I always used to word it to my staff. I said, we got the best of both worlds. And quite frankly, a lot of my staff, when I first introduced it that way, did not know what I was talking about. Like, what's this guy saying? Because they weren't versed in Du Bois and Booker T. and Washington. So I had to teach that. And then as I taught it, the difference between the philosophy of Du Bois and the philosophy of Washington, and here we got them both in that building. I said, man, we can take this to another level. But I want to empower these boys at the same time, and then ultimately empower my young ladies. But I'm gonna focus on the boys for the sake of this presentation. But everything I'm gonna say to you about the boys, we did the same thing with the young ladies, right? So I said, I need an empowerment program where it's not an after school program, which will not guarantee me 100% participation. It can't be a before school program for the same reason. I don't want to do it during the lunch period or pull out of a sample of students. I said, I need this thing to be inherent in what we do throughout the course of a school day, right? So I'm going to go to their parents and I'm going to sell it, that this male empowerment, which we call young men's empowerment, is just as significant as math and science. And mom, while I got your ear, I need your son to come to school in a shirt and tie, slack shoes, and a belt. And then my staff, my male staff, I need you guys on board. But in addition to you, because I don't have many of you, it's not like I got a school full of black and brown men, but that's okay. We're talking about the power in us right now. So here's what I got. Outside of the walls of that gymnasium is a city called Newark, or a county called Essex. That means there are a whole plethora of men out there. What I don't have in the building, I can supplement by what's outside of the building. I can go to them and say, look, I got a program here. We building men here, but I need you to be a part of this. Can you give me like one day out of your life? And the reason I said one day is because as soon as we made it public that we had this program, I never had to recruit again. Because once the word was out, man, Principal Kafele got a young men's empowerment program at the school. All the men were practically figuratively tearing my doors down to come into the school to engage my male students. Everybody wanted to be there. So the work, excuse me, of recruiting, give me a bottle of water, man. The work of recruiting was not difficult because everybody wanted to be in that building. I'm hoping I'm not going to lose my voice on this recording. Thank you. All right, so I feel strong again. Here we go. Everybody wanted to be there. So now the question became, who are we going to recruit from? Like what category or categories of men? Need a little more. When you do these Zoom presentations all day like I do, you need some water. So I said, well, I want everybody. I want the highly successful all the way to the OG that did a 10-year bid and everybody in between. I want them all. And that's what we did. We vetted these men and they came into our school. I created a framework because we weren't just preaching to kids. That's not what this was. This was structured. We said, we're trying to build men. I got 80% of my guys going home every day to a fatherless household. We did the research and figured out the number, 80, 85%, depending on what year. They're going home to a household and mom is struggling to be mother and father simultaneously. I said, we could fix that. I know we could fix that. We'll be that void. So now every Monday, I said, young men, I need you to come to school in shirt, tie, slack, shoes, and a belt. Of course, I had to sell that on their parents because I need their parents to push that at home. I needed them to reinforce that because they didn't want to come dressed like that. And they knew by law they didn't have to. They knew that. But if I could sell their parents that once I get your son in that shirt and tie and confuse the public and make the public think that he's the principal of the building, because that was the whole objective for them and me to blend together. So when someone sees me, they say, yeah, I guess he's the principal. But then they see my young men, but he might be the principal. He might be the principal. You see where I'm going with that. I needed my men looking the part, my young men. So now he bought into it after a while. First year I did this, the whole school was in the boys' bathrooms at dismissal, changing their clothes back to their street clothes. By year 2, they weren't thinking about changing back. They were walking through their neighborhoods proudly with them shirts and ties. So we said this. I said, I need to bring them together by grade level once a month for 4 hours. So, because I couldn't compromise the academic program because we were breaking records doing that. So I said, I want to have this conversation for 4 hours once a month. So I only had access to him in that venue once a month in the cafeteria, much smaller group than you see in the picture. And we broke things down we looked at 5 strands. And here were the strands. Strand number 1. What's it look like to be a young man in relationship to himself? We're talking about his own personal growth and development from going from point A to point B. I knew I had a school full of young men that could see the goal from afar, but had no idea how to get to the goal. They didn't know what the strategies were. They didn't understand personal growth and development. We said, let's spend 4 years helping them to develop that characteristic. Number 2, what's it look like to be a young man in relationship to these young ladies in the building? I listened to a lot of hip hop music, especially up to, let's say, up to about the last 2 years. I mean, I was listening to it more than the average teenager for decades because I wanted to stay relevant with the students. So if I listen to their music, then at least it gives me a sense of who they are music-wise. The messages that are being programmed into their minds on a regular basis. And a lot of that message was that gross denigration of the woman. If he doesn't have that man in his life to balance that, then where's it going to come from? So now we're having that conversation. She's not what the rapper depicted her to be. She's not what the media depicted her to be. She's a woman. She's a queen. We sharing that message for 4 years at the high school level, 3 years at the middle school level, and whatever number of years a principal decides is appropriate at the elementary level. For me, I was a 5th grade teacher, so that's where it was, 5th and 4th. So we're having that conversation because we want to counteract everything that the rapper that's putting filth out, negativity out. The one that's putting out the positive, fine, that's not an issue. But the one that's putting out that negativity, that destruction, we want to counter that. Number 3, what's it look like to be a man in relationship to the son that he may have? Because we know that they're not all going to have a child. Not the son, the child he may have. But what if he does have a child? Is he going to be prepared for that? Let's start planting those seeds now while they're with us. What fathers do when they have children. Because he's not seeing it. And then when we were having that conversation, a lot of my guys, particularly my juniors and seniors, they would become very vocal in those conversations because we're trying to plant seeds for the future, and they couldn't get past the present. So while we're talking about the future, they're talking about the father that they hate right now because he's not in their lives. This happened all the time. So I would use that. We would use that. Okay, you don't like your father, and he's nearby, but you don't have the access to him that you want. So I'm asking the question: are you going to grow up to be the same man? So now we can have that constructive conversation, right? So planting seeds of what fathers do versus what they do not do, or what males do versus what men do. Strand number 4. What's it look like to be a man in relationship to his male peers? Every school I led, middle school and high school, was a gang-infested school. The middle school with youngsters who were gearing up. High school, they made the decision, right? So now I got all these different gang sets in the school. So part of the conversation became, but wait a minute, y'all. That which binds you together is much more potent than those artificial colors that are separating you. And we were able to bridge that gap. Those young men were able to exhibit who they were intellectually without fear of the social consequences from their peers, because we created, again, that culture that allowed that to happen. And then number 5, what's it look like to be a young man in relationship to his community? We pose all of these as self-reflective questions as you gathered. What's it look like to be a young man in relationship to his community? Are you an asset to your community? Or are you a liability? Or are you just non-existent? Who are you as it relates to your community? Or who will you become? Who will you evolve into as it relates to your community? Those were important conversations. But in addition to that, at the senior year, that meant that your title switched from being called senior to being called co-principal. I held you responsible for being responsible for the incoming 9th graders. 8th graders responsible for the incoming 6th graders. So we're teaching you leadership, we're teaching you oratory, we're teaching you history, we're teaching you responsibility. So they were responsible. And what did that look like? Well, this first day of every month, my senior class, my males, were responsible for talking to the freshman class, my males, about their responsibilities in that school. Academically, socially, emotionally, behaviorally, you name it. That was their responsibility. Come to school on a Monday, shirt, tie, slacks, shoes, and a belt, and play the role of me, the principal. Then we would get on school buses, 25 at a time, and go to elementary schools and do the same thing. See, so we teach. So again, we're talking about the power in us. This is not just me. This is me, my staff, and those men I brought in, and then the women are doing the same thing down the hall with my young ladies. And we're building something different. I don't need rule charts on my wall, because the culture is always the mouthpiece for the rules. And when attention is not given to the culture of a school, the culture of a classroom, then issues of behavior manifest themselves every time, because we haven't given attention to the culture, the macro of the building of the classroom. Moving on. So getting to social justice, it's interesting how the world is changing. I can actually, in 2020, put a picture of George Floyd on a presentation, when in the past, I don't know, right? But here we are in 2020, and social unrest, social change, and social justice in the school, right? Because young people, they experienced the summer. They saw it on television. Some of them were out there marching and protesting and demonstrating and expressing their outrage, and however they did. So young people are very familiar. So the question becomes, as a school, do we meet it head on, or do we sweep it under the rug? Do we run away from it? Do we hide from it? Do we pretend it didn't happen? Do we circumvent it, or do we meet it? See, I told you, back in my days in 1988, and in my first days as principal in 1998, I was a social justice educator because I didn't know better. I just didn't have language. I couldn't say, I'm a social justice educator. I'm just talking about the world as it related to my students. I'm talking history as it related to my students. But interestingly, as I'm looking at the minute hand moving kind of fast, so I mean, let me keep it moving. Interestingly, after, and I share this with educators literally every day. This is the second time today now. Right when the rebellions began, /rioting, and the TV stations are keying in on that, in addition to George Floyd's murder over 8 minutes and 46 seconds by a Minneapolis police officer, right? You know, it was interesting that educators started writing me. They were sending me emails. They were sending me DMs on Twitter. They were sending me inboxes on Facebook. They were just writing on my thread, and they were asking me, what do you recommend that I read? And the teacher in me could not recommend for them what they wanted. I knew what they wanted. They wanted books because, here's their language. They said, Principal Kafele, I need to further or better understand systemic racism. These were my white colleagues, not folks that I know, just me being a public person in the education world, and folks feeling like, well, I think Principal Kafele might have some answers for us. So they're reaching out to me. Principal Kafele, I'm trying to understand systemic racism. I'm trying to understand white privilege. I'm trying to understand white supremacy. Can you make some recommendations for me? I knew what they wanted. I can rattle off the titles of the books they wanted, but the teacher in me said, I'm not recommending those books right now. We can do that later. They wanted critiques, analyses, breakdowns, theories of racism in America, 2020. I said, no. See, the teacher in me, and that's just me in terms of who I am as an educator. I say, if I recommend those books, they will read them. They'll have an understanding of racism, but they won't know the history. They won't know the 401-year coexistence of blacks and whites in America, and they'll still have a hole in their understanding. I said, I'm not going to recommend those books. I got other books I'm going to recommend. I said, but I'm not going to do what so many educators do during Black History Month and start the children off during the period of enslavement, which puts the children at a deficit, and in many cases, a lifelong deficit. The Black children, and puts the white children, gives them a superiority complex. So I said, put them at a surplus. So I'm not going to do that. I said, teacher, here's my first book I want to recommend to you. Introduction to African Civilizations. I said, I want you to understand the African in relationship thousands of years ago, in leading up to enslavement. I want you to understand the African in relationship to science, technology, mathematics, algebra, trigonometry, calculus, geometry, engineering, architecture, astronomy, astrology, agriculture, medicine, scholarship, and I can go on and on. I said, I want to create cognitive dissonance. I want to dispel all the distortions, all the myths that you've had up here all your life in terms of what pop culture and curriculum have fed you over your lifetime. I want to blow your mind. I didn't say that. That was my thinking when I made the recommendation. But guess what happened? Once they started reading them, after they got them, the folks that were asking me for the recommendation, they started tweeting them on Twitter. And they would tweet the cover. And they would give me an explanation. Principal Kafele, I'm upset, I'm mad, I'm angry because I've been teaching for 20 years. I've been teaching for 25 years, for example, and I've never been exposed to this before. How did I go through my life and I've never known this? I said, because you've been deceived. And because you've been deceived, you have been positioned to deceive your children. So your children did not get what they needed in terms of understanding who they are, historically speaking. So that was the first book. Second, I said, I need you to understand African Americans in terms of the history. Before we start talking about an analysis of racism, I said, you need to understand what it has meant to live in this country from 1619 all the way to the present. I need you to understand the detail, the intricacies of what it has meant to be Black in America for all these years. Right. So I said, Lerone Bennett Jr. lays it down before the Mayflower, but I coupled that with what John Hope Franklin wrote in From Slavery to Freedom. So between the two books, I'm saying, teacher, read them. If I had access to every college president or education department chair and state commissioners of education across the country, I would say that no teacher should leave a pre-service program, and particularly to teach Black children, urban, rural, and those even in suburban districts, should not be permitted to graduate until they have read these three books. Now, are there others I could recommend? Yeah, but these are great introductory books for that teacher that has no knowledge of anything that regards this. Right? So then I said, but let me throw a fourth one in there that's not a history book, but just a book I feel they need. And that's The Miseducation of the Negro. I said, here, as I always say, if an educator has one Black child in that building, principal, if you got one Black child in that building, then your staff needs to read this book. Right? So to whomever, that person needs to be armed with the knowledge of this particular book. And the title alone is a whole 2-hour staff meeting. The Miseducation, not the education, the Miseducation of the Negro. So now here's me as principal, right? So the Miseducation of the Negro. We're talking about the power in us. I can't have a staff that's not armed with that information. Regardless of if I'm at Sojourner Truth Middle or whatever school that I'm leading, I need my staff to understand the contents of that book, among others. Because if we're serious, if we're serious about the power in us, then they've got to be armed with that kind of information, right? Or they're not going to be positioned to make those connections with children that they may not know. See, I always say you can't teach who you don't know, and you can't teach what you don't know. But see, moving on, therefore, so let's look at that social justice education. Like, what is it? What does that mean? And it's interesting. I'll put the question there. I'm one of those guys that just, everybody's different. And I'm just one who has the audacity. That's like one of my words, audacity. I look at a lot of different words, jargon, sometimes just words that we use in education that are not necessarily jargon. And I say, I don't like this word. I want to word it differently. And I want to define it differently, I say, not the word, but I want to give it different meaning. So I looked at all the various definitions of social justice education, and I didn't like them. And I said, because it's not comprehensive for me. It doesn't have enough. I said, so I'm going to create my own. And I did. And a whole lot of people are using it. Let me share it with you. I'm going to read it to you, but I'm going to share it with you because I got certain emphasis on certain words. Let me read it to you. It says, social justice education is the ongoing, student-centered, I got to put emphasis there, student-centered exploration, examination, and assessment of the world upon which your students exist through their own lens. I got to put emphasis there. Let me stop it right there. Because here we're saying student-centered. It's not about the teacher. And that's why I had to write this thing myself. It's not about the teacher. It's not about how the teacher sees and interprets the world. It's about the student and how the student sees and interprets the world through their lens, although the teacher does play the role of facilitator. But if it's anything less than that, and it's about the teacher's views on the world, then we're not talking about social justice education. We're talking teacher-driven indoctrination. Those are two different things. And that teacher-driven indoctrination is not a good thing. Let me keep it moving. It's an interdisciplinary critical analysis of the world around them with respect to their relationship with it and how they fit in it via their own self-expression. Let me stop it right there. It's interdisciplinary. See, it's not, let's do math at 8, let's do science at 9, let's do language arts at 10, let's do social studies at 11, let's do social justice education at 12. It's not what it is. It's how do we infuse social justice into math? How do we infuse social justice education into science? How do we infuse it into social studies? How do we infuse it into language arts? And then that teacher that wants to have that separate conversation, that's not a bad thing, but that's not what it is. And that's why I had to draw up my own definition. It is interdisciplinary, right? So it's, I don't want just the social studies teacher to think, okay, this is where the social justice comes in. No, a math teacher with that word problem, or even if it's not in the book you use, but or the software, but your creativity and talking about numbers and percentages out there in the world and how you can tie that into social justice, such as you got a city that the entire population or 80% of the residents are Black, but the businesses are not Black. And now we can look at that through a mathematical problem, but also through a social justice in terms of the lack of access to loans, startup capital, etc. That's a math lesson. So now it makes the math relevant because it's real through the lens of the student. And now we can talk social justice at the same time that we talk mathematics. And then the same thing applies to science and all the other subject areas. So through their own self-expression relative to issues of social justice, social injustice, and overall systemic, institutional, and individual racism, whether it be unconscious, implicit, and or explicit. So now I got some questions I want to throw at you, and this might just take me to the end. I got about 5 questions I want to throw your way. Number 1, and you'll notice that I always ask questions self-reflectively because I want my listener to look within themselves on my question. I don't ask in the second person. I want you to always look at yourself. So here I'm saying, what are the reasons that social justice education either exists or doesn't exist in my classroom? Now, I've got embedded in these questions. I know that there are two questions that you need to answer, right, in terms of getting continuing education credits, right? So that will be this next question. Is the first one. Can my students, particularly my students of color, articulate beyond emotional reactions the injustices that surround them? That's going to be that first question in terms of the ones that you need. So let me explain what I mean by that. Something happens in the world. Like right now, what we're reading, we're learning about yet another shooting, Jacob Blake in Wisconsin. So it's one thing to react with anger, like I'm mad, right? The person might say, I'm angry, I'm upset, or you may just see the reaction of an individual. But I'm asking, here's my question as it relates to number 3. Can my students, particularly my students of color, go beyond the anger? Like can they articulate it now? Beyond emotional reaction, the injustices that surround them? Can they intellectualize based on the discussions that you've had over a period of time, that youngster has broader context, not just I'm upset about a situation that happened now, but does that youngster have an understanding of how it's couched within a 401-year experience? See, that's a different conversation now, right? Does that youngster have an understanding of systemic racism, right? So now I understand it in that broader context of why we've seen it happen time after time after time, but it has happened again, and I'm able to articulate why that continues to happen, right? Can I intellectualize it within a historical, within a cultural framework beyond just my anger that it has occurred? So I'll couple that with the second question for you guys in terms of your requirements. Do I possess the necessary cultural competency to engage my students in issues of social justice? See, I can't talk about this. I can't engage my students in this conversation if I don't have the cultural competency to do so. I can't do it. So in order for me to engage them in that conversation, there's a certain level of competency that I have to have, right? I have to have done certain reading. So certainly those books that I just showed you, I've got to read them as the educator. I've got to read Intro to African Civilization. I got to read Before the Mayflower. I've got to read From Slavery to Freedom. I've got to read The Miseducation of the Negro. I've got to read Journey to Liberation, and we could go on and on, right? In terms of me developing a sense of cultural competency, because I may be teaching, and culturally my students may be very different from me, right? It could be that we're from two different racial backgrounds, two different ethnic backgrounds, or we could be of the same race, the same ethnicity, but culturally we are worlds apart and we miss each other. When the assumption would be made, well, they're both Black teachers, Black students, Black, they should be connected. No, not necessarily. Because culturally, we may be very different. So that has to be taken into consideration. So do I bring the cultural competency to make those connections with my students toward engaging them in issues of social justice, right? You keep going. What type of professional development, professional learning do I attend toward developing a comfort and a confidence in engaging my students in issues of social justice, right? What type of PD do I attend? And I don't mean professional development that you've been assigned to, but I mean professional development that you said, you surveyed the landscape and you said, I'm deficient in this area. I watched the television over the summer. I went to a march. I had a sign. I chanted in the streets, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. I did that, right? You might be saying. But now to shift gears and engage youngster in that conversation, are you comfortable doing it? Are you knowledgeable? Can you do it in a way that you're not offensive? Can you do it in a way that stimulates good discussion and learning for the young people? Or do you need to attend to various social, professional development, engage in various reading, interact with various people that may be more knowledgeable than you may be? What are some of those things? So all that has to be taken into consideration. And then lastly, how knowledgeable am I on issues of social justice that directly impact my students of color, right? Like what do I know? What do I know relative to what is the experience of being Black, right? Of being brown. In this case, I guess we're really talking Black. So what do I know about the experiences of walking in the shoes of my Black students? What do I know about that? Right? What do I know about walking through their neighborhoods? What do I know about walking through their stores? What do I know about walking to the stadium? Right? So the experience is so different. You know, like if I could use myself as an example, I'm a speaker. You guys know that. I speak at big conferences. I'm on big stages. But I'll tell you something. When I walk into a convention center and I'm a keynote speaker, make no mistake about it. Make zero mistake about it. If I'm not thinking about it when I walked in, the reactions remind me. You Black guy, buddy. You Black man walking into this convention center. You're not walking in here as the keynote speaker. You walking in here as the Black keynote speaker, right? Now, I don't have an issue with that, but I know that that's how I'm being seen, right? So therefore, my speaker colleague who may not be Black, but walking in that same space, the experience may be very different because the experience might be there as the speaker. But a lot of times for me, and one might say, but how do you know this, Kafele? Because I engage I engage my audience members in this conversation because I'm curious. So I've engaged them in this conversation. When you saw me walk in, did you see the speaker or did you see the Black speaker? And usually that makes people very uncomfortable and they don't want to answer and they're quiet and won't say anything, but I keep pushing and I keep pushing and I keep pushing. And then finally they say, well, I saw the Black speaker. But why couldn't I just be the speaker? And the answer is very simple, because you're an aberration. Because depending on where I am and what their exposure has been, they may not have ever seen a Black speaker in person. And that happens in a lot of places that I go. Their students are Black, but they've never seen a presenter, a Black man, bringing this information. So now I got to deal with that internally, meaning the person. So speaking while Black, it's part of my reality. So let me go back to number 6 as I close out. How knowledgeable am I on issues of social justice that directly impact my students of color? And I guess the analogy I was drawing was just the reality of one being conscious of their Blackness and what that means as they navigate the world. Well, we think about that. It's just up here all the time, right? Du Bois talked about it when he talked about the dual consciousness, right? But that's for a whole other conversation. We won't even broach that right now. All right, I just want to remind everybody out there the 2 questions. First one, which is number 3 on the list, but it was, can my students, particularly my students of color, articulate beyond emotional reactions the injustices that surround them? And the second one, which was number 4 on my list, do I have the necessary cultural competency to engage my students in issues of social justice? But what I wanted to close out and give you, because I'm not going to get to this, because we don't have time, so that's for another time, but I wanted to give you this. It's my contact information, principalkafele.com, and you see everything else there, my books, my YouTube channels, and my leadership Academy, Virtual Assistant Principal Leadership Academy, every Saturday morning at 11 o'clock Eastern. If leadership is your thing, particularly assistant principal leadership, but any kind of leadership is your thing, then you want to be on Facebook Live or Twitter Live with me every Saturday through May 2021, live talking leadership. But other than that, I'm just honored to be a part of this this talk here today. Very important in terms of everything that's entailed here. And I hope that my words were beneficial to the objectives to this forum being put on in the first place. With that being said, I thank you immensely.